So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Dr.
Awesome.
Bruno.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for all of you for coming out for this. And I think we'll have a fun couple of days here. The thought we had was to, do this over lunch. I'll talk about some things, and then at the end of the week, to have a little bit of time on Wednesday to have a bit more give back and kind of Q&A. So I'm going to give you an assignment too. You don't have to do it, but I'm just going to, over the next couple of days, hand you this assignment to see what we might come up with during this week together. Like Laura said, I'm Eric Barreto. I teach New Testament at Princeton Seminary. I taught at Luther Seminary for 7 years, including Scott, who, despite my best efforts, and Laura too, right? And this is who you are. So this is great. Very proud of the alums that came through. And I work a lot in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, thinking also a lot about race and ethnicity in the ancient world. So what I want to do this week is spend a little bit of time looking at the series of texts that we find after Easter. So after the Easter season, the lectionary does this every year. Does a strange thing where in the place of the Old Testament texts, it starts placing a bunch of Acts texts. And it's the biggest chunk of Acts that we get. So from Easter morning until Pentecost, which we would expect to be Acts heavy, you have these Acts texts all the way through. So the challenge I'd like to call you all to is to preach in the season after Easter, to kind of spend some time in the book of Acts and how this text might help open up possibilities for your preaching during this time. Before I say a little bit more about that, I wanted to note that the chat is open. So if you wanted to, comments, questions, whatever, I'll try to keep an eye on it, but so is Laura along the way. But definitely have that conversation there. It's one of the advantages, I think, of being able to meet online like this, is that we can have like these parallel conversations happening all at once. So first, how and why to read Acts in the first place? Now, if you grew up in the church in any way like I did, this is often how we would read the book of Acts. People would say something like, we would be a much better church if we did things like they did in the early church. This sense that the book of Acts narrates a perfect church or a really good church or a church that we should emulate and mimic. I sometimes talk about this, treating the book of Acts like an instruction manual for putting together the perfect church, maybe either an IKEA, when you're putting together the shelf, or a Lego manual. And if we just put the pieces together like they did, that this would eventuate in us having this beautiful, perfect church that God has called us to be. This gets tricky though. So there are places where this really works. We'll talk about this text here in a second, but in Acts chapter 4, talks about how all the folks were giving their possessions to the church, selling their possessions, giving them to the church, and there's not a needy person among them. There's this picture of a beautiful picture of unity that there you might get a sense. This is why people might think, let's be like that church. What we don't notice, and I'll talk more about this here in a second, is that chapter 5 starts with the word but a man named Ananias and Sapphira. So we want to celebrate the end of chapter 4 and this utopian vision, but we don't want to really think a lot about the beginning of chapter 5. In my reading, what we have in the book of Acts is a church that is as beautiful and as broken as any community I've ever known. It shows a church at its heights and at its depths. It shows a church trying to make sense of a complicated and broken world. And in that way, I think that church in Acts is a lot like the context in which we find ourselves. Not a perfect church that we try to strive to become, but a deeply human community seeking after a God who's in the business of resurrection. So one of the big mistakes I think we make in reading the book of Acts is in thinking that this is a text about us. It's about the church. It's about community. But before it's that, before it's a text about the church and the community and who we are, it's primarily a text about the character and nature of God. And when we call it the Acts of the Apostles, we mistitle that text because it's not really a narration of what the apostles did, but a narration of all the things that God is doing in and through and with these communities. So in our teaching and in our preaching and our reading of these texts, I would exhort us to turn first to what kind of picture of God, what kind of narration, what kind of imagination is stirred in us about who God is, and how that confession overflows into how we relate to one another, how we form community, how we treat one another if we are a community that believes in the resurrection power of Jesus. So for me, one of the key words when thinking about how we interpret Acts and how we read Acts is imagination. Because if this were instruction manual for putting together the perfect church, you could just have a list of instructions, a list of rules, a whole bunch of sermons telling you what a good church looks like. But what we have in Acts is a whole lot of narration, including narration that sometimes feels like I'm at a movie theater in the summer instead of in church on Sunday morning. So think about the end of Acts in particular. You find there prison breaks, you find there a shipwreck. And in one of my favorite stories, there's a snake that jumps out of a fire, bites Paul's hand, he shakes it off, and everybody thinks he's going to die. Like they're like, oh, the sea didn't get him, but this snake got him. It's like that movie Final Destination. I don't know if y'all remember that movie, where death is always pursuing people. It's a horror movie. It's very silly. Anyway, so it feels like a delightful like summer movie. All kinds of goofy, entertaining things are happening all the time. The question is, what do we do with a text like that? So say, the story of Eutychus. Anybody remember that story of Eutychus? Poor Eutychus is sitting by a window. Paul's preaching late to the night, and he's preaching, and Eutychus falls out the window and he dies. How many of you could read that text on a Sunday morning and no one would crack a smile? No one would think that story is funny and weird and a little bit confusing. We would treat it a little too seriously because, right, it's the word of God, right? The word of God is supposed to be serious. But in this case, I think Acts is very much interested in delighting our senses too. In that part of your brain that delights at a car chase or at a big explosion in the movies or something like that, right? That part of the kind of storytelling we do around campfires, that's something that Acts is trying to tap into, that storytelling, imaginative place. So that's one thing we can pay attention to, is what kind of imagination are these texts inspiring in us? And what kind of imagination might they inspire and shape in the people who've been nurtured all around us, who've been called to lead? And I think imagination is important for me because, and I wonder if this might be the case with you all as well. I mean, in the work of ministry that you all have done, I'm guessing you know what death looks like and feels like and smells like. You know what it's like to go to a hospital bed and be with someone as they breathe their last. You've been there when relationships are falling apart. You've been there when someone's inner life is falling apart. We know what death looks like, feels like, and smells like. But when it comes to the power of resurrection, I think we humans, we Christians, we need an awful lot of help, and maybe especially in the middle of a pandemic. We know what death has looked like. We know what it's a little hard to fathom, right? But we know that number of more than 500,000 people in this country having died, and all the separation that we've endured. We know what that looks like, feels like, smells like, but what we need more help with is imagining what the shape of resurrection might be in our midst. And I think that's the kind of imagination that Acts is after, and something we'll emphasize throughout our time together. All right, so that's how and why we read Acts, at least a little starting off point. It's narration, it's about imagination, and it's not a perfect blueprint for putting together the perfect church. It's these really exciting and weird stories meant to evoke our imaginations. And that primarily here we're starting first with a confession about who God is, and then secondarily, and deriving from that, a sense of the shape of the community of those seeking after Jesus. All right, so I want to point here to 3 scholarly questions about Acts that keep popping up in recent days that I think will come to bear some on some of the questions we have before us. I'm not going to go super deep into this, just so you are aware of some of these conversations happening. One is an old conversation about the genre of Acts. What kind of book is this? And this is important because when we know what kind of thing we're reading, we know how to approach and how to read it, right? So if you pick up a piece of paper and it says, "Dear Senator so-and-so," you know what kind of text that is, and you know the conventions. So when it says, "Dear Senator so-and-so," you don't have to assume that they have like this close romantic relationship, right? You might call your spouse dear, but when you're talking in the letters, right, it's just a convention. It's just something that you do. Or if you pick up a piece of paper and it starts off by saying, "Once upon a time," you know the rules of a fairy tale. You know how to read that. You know what that thing is good for and how it can make meaning. So similarly, it's important for us to think about the genre of Acts. Think about what kind of text this is. Often in the church and in scholarship, Acts has been treated primarily as a history. And here, not modern history, but within the ancient conventions of historiography. And again, there's a big, long discussion about that. But one of the ways that we see this happening in our treatment of the book of Acts is that so often Acts is mined for data about Pauline biography and chronology. If we just had the letters, those awesome maps that we have in the back of the Bible showing all Paul's missionary journeys, would be impossible to reconstruct. But Acts helps give some of that chronological and biographical structure for Paul's ministry and life. So we see that happening. But I think that doesn't exhaust how this text might mean. It's not just a prelude to Pauline letters, and it's not just a record of when things happened. There are moments when Luke is very concerned with historical moments. He, for example, at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, all these critical moments, especially in the first two chapters, will say, when so-and-so was high priest, when so-and-so was the emperor. It's a way less about chronology, but about setting the stage of the story he's trying to tell. To say that this story, so you think about the first two chapters of the Gospel of Luke, all the infancy stuff happening there, this story about this baby of a couple of peasants living in the middle of nowhere in Galilee, like that story should be resonating in the throne room of Caesar. But it's a story that probably so many people in power didn't notice. So that even when Luke is using these historical references, it's less so that we know what time it is, and more that we know what kind of time it is. The time of God's appearance, a time of revolution in God's appearance among us. So more and more, there's a lot of folks who are reading Acts as a work of theology, and especially as a work of literature. That when we think about the genre of Acts, perhaps putting Luke alongside Thucydides and Herodotus has some benefit. But in my mind, when it comes to preaching, thinking about this as a theological work and as a work of literature opens up all kinds of preaching possibilities for this text. To think about this as something maybe more like a novel, like a story, like a story you would tell around a campfire. So that's the first one, is about genre. Second is that there's quite a bit of scholarly debate about how Luke and the Acts of the Apostles thinks about empire in particular. And this is a question we ask in the study of Paul and the study of Revelation. What do these New Testament texts and authors think about the Roman Empire? Do they see it as a threat to be overcome? Do they see it as something that's so insignificant in light of God's arrival that we don't need to worry about it, or something in between? So for a long time, Acts was read as kind of creating the conditions for the Christian church to survive within the Roman Empire. That Luke and Acts are written to Theophilus, who is a Roman official, to say basically, we Christians are not a threat to Roman order. You can leave us alone. We'll do our thing over here. We'll pay our taxes. We'll just, it's a kind of form of accommodation to say we are not a threat to the empire. I just can't imagine, however, that Theophilus, if he were a Roman official, would read, I don't know if you've noticed, but Luke and Acts are pretty long. Together, they're a quarter of the New Testament. If you go back and look at Luke and Acts, think about the amount of knowledge about the Septuagint, about Israel, that's assumed in so many of these stories. I'm not sure that Acts is calling, as a defense, as an apology to Rome for the presence of Christians. I do think, however, that the insights of post-colonial folks and post-colonial communities and post-colonial approaches can be really helpful here. In the shadow of empire, when the author of Acts and the communities that first read them would have read this text, would have heard this text, would have interpreted this text, they lack in political power in this imperial system. It's not like they get to vote for the emperor and or for senators or anything like that. They don't have an awful lot of power. So here we have to look at other folks dominated by imperial forces and to learn from them how their complex negotiations with empire shape a community. So what we don't have in Acts, I think, is on the one hand, mere accommodation to say, we're not really a threat to you, Rome, leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Nor will you see some kind of full-throated call to armed resistance. The sense that, we should go out to the battlefield, we can take Rome off of Rome's pedestal. But something far more complicated and maybe really instructive for those of us who are in a lot of ways beneficiaries of all kinds of imperial forces in our lives. That we are not subject to colonizing forces in the same ways that the early readers and Luke would have been of empire. So maybe we can help nurture an imagination for what it means for us who are often living in the bellies of empire to figure out what it means to have a faithful life within the constraints of an imperial imagination. And third, big questions that have been asked about Acts for a long time about how Luke in Acts thinks about ancient Judaism, first century Judaism. Is Acts embracing of Jews and Jewish people as part of these communities? Or is Acts imagining, foregrounding, promoting a vision where eventually Israelites would be outside, and Jewish people would be outside these communities gathered around the worship of God? And you'll find scholars in all kinds of different camps in these questions. I'm not sure we can resolve that scholarly question in our work, but I think in knowing about that debate, there is this pressing concern for us as preachers, is that it has been so easy for all of us, for me, and maybe for you too, to preach a good news that is always bad news for our Jewish neighbors, whether today or in antiquity. The ways that we use Pharisee, for example, as a synonym for hypocrite. The ways that we don't tell the full story of how first century Judaism thought about grace and about the law. Well, especially in the first couple of weeks, we're going to run into texts where Peter is making accusations against local people there who were part of the execution of Jesus on the cross. I think we have to be very careful that in reading those texts, we don't reinforce these patterns that in so much of Christian preaching that puts our Jewish neighbors in the position of being enemies of the gospel. So we'll keep talking about this as we go along, but that's a third scholarly question I want to put in front of us. Okay, then we're going to jump into the text. One last thing is 3 interpretive issues that I want to make sure are before us these next 2 days. Number one, I already talked some about, is that Acts is not a blueprint for putting together the perfect church, right? It's this narrative source of imagination. Second, we're going to notice that the lectionary selections, not always, but pretty often, tend to privilege the speeches of Acts. So it's the sermons. It's the words that are spoken by Peter and Paul and all these other folks. That's the focus of the lectionary selections. This goes back, I think, to some former ideas about the book of Acts, that in the speeches is where Luke felt the most freedom to have his kind of deepest impact and be able to most shape his perspective on theology. So if you want to know what Luke's theology is, go to the speeches, because that's the stuff he wrote. The other stuff he might have gotten from other sources, but it's the speeches where he has the most freedom. But I think that's problematic. I think it is true that by the conventions of antiquity, folks had a lot of liberty in writing speeches and sermons. And this happens again in Herodotus and Thucydides and those other spaces. There wasn't there somebody like writing down word for word what famous people would have said in critical moments in history. So the historians would recreate what would have been said, what should have been said in those contexts. So yeah, Luke has some freedom here. But I think we see in the gospel that Luke has a lot of freedom in the narratives that he chooses to. We can look at how he uses and reshapes the Gospel of Mark to see that for Luke, it's not just the things that are said, but the narrations of what happens in these early communities are really important. So the lectionary is going to try to take us to the speeches. What I'm going to exhort us to do is to make sure we bring in the context that precipitated that speech making. And third, I want to suggest is that our stories and our identities are not disposable in our preaching and teaching about these texts. I want to say that our stories, our identities are valuable gifts that can be infused by the Spirit's inspiration. I hope that you read these texts in the fullness of your experience, in the fullness of all that God has nurtured in your life. If you were taught in seminary that when it comes to reading the Bible, you have to leave aside all questions about your identity, your gender, your sexuality, your race, whatever it is, I want to suggest to you to try something different. That God did not call some generic human being to preach a generic word, but you, the particular person that God nurtured you to be, and the particular people with their particular stories in the particular place that God has called you to serve. And in that particularity, in all those particularities, there's a lot for us to learn about how the Spirit might be leading us. All right, so that's all the introductory stuff. Any questions, anything you want me to clarify before we jump into the first few texts after Easter? All right, so let's go to, okay, we're going to start with the second Sunday after Easter. And that's, where is it? Acts, and the end of Acts chapter 4, if I remember right. Hold on, where is it? I wrote that. Acts 4, 32 to 35. That's where we're going to start. As you go there, here's the overall thesis I'm going to have for our time together this week. And then I'll copy and paste it here in the chat so you can see it too. And I might change my mind about this and I might tweak it as I go along, but this is what I think is happening in these texts. The book of Acts narrates the shape of communities shaped by a God who effects resurrection. And so the book functions by stirring our imaginations about the character of God and the shape of communities gathered around God's resurrection power. That's my assumption about what's happening in Acts. If you're preaching through this text, I might encourage you to write a text, a couple sentences like this for yourself. Know that you might need to edit them as you go along, but to kind of provide that sense of the wholeness of what's happening in this preaching series would be helpful. And for me, there's a part of the text for these first couple of weeks where folks ask Peter and his companions, by what power or what name do you do these things? And for me, that's the overarching question. By what power or what name? That's going to be, for me, the overall theme of our work together. By what power or what name? All right, Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32. Would somebody be willing to read 32 to 35 for us?
Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. So this is one of those utopian texts that we talked about earlier, right? The text that makes us think, this is what we're supposed to be like. There's a lot to say about these few little verses. One is that this description is not exactly a one-time description. It's earlier mentioned, a kind of similar description, but this description doesn't seem to come up again. So when Paul visits communities, Christian communities in other parts of the narrative, they're not described quite in this way. So I think one big question for us is, what function does this little story, this little utopian story, have for us? And I think the mistake here would be to treat this as an absolute model that's just going to make us feel bad about our inability to live in a community like this. So I'm reading this and I see no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common, and that there was not a needy person among them. It starts off by saying there was a whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul. And that vision is one that's so appealing to me, especially in these pandemic days. After so much separation, after so much loss, this vision, there's part of me that's really drawn to it. There's part of me that wants to be part of precisely this kind of community. And if our preaching just tells people that because they can't do this, they should feel bad about themselves, and I think we're missing the function of this text. It's not to give us this model to say this is what the only way a church might be, the only way a community might be. Remember where I started too, like if we start with us, I think we miss a vital part of what Acts is doing. If we start with community right away and who we're supposed to be and who I'm supposed to be, then we're missing a critical part of this narrative. So the first place to look is what confession about God is underlying this vision of community. And that's, I think, what we find in verse 33. Even if I read verse 33, my instinct is to jump from verse 32, but everything they owned was held in common, to verse 34, there was not a needy person among them. To say that the reason there's not a needy person among them is because everything they owned was held in common. That it's human behavior, human decisions that create the conditions for the absence of need. But notice what's in verse 33, and I don't think it's incidental that Luke writes it this way. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. That it's in the preaching, the belief, a community shaped in the power of the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection that Jesus experienced, but also the resurrection that Jesus promises us, that's the source for this community to be able to be of one heart and soul. It's not that the behavior is incidental, but it derives from a vision of the resurrection power of Jesus. And then notice that, and great grace was upon them all. Great grace that presumably comes not from people's generosity, as important as that is, but from God's generosity in the power of the resurrection. And again, if we just read this in isolation as the lectionary would have us read, then I just think, man, I can't do this, right? And there might be all kinds of bad reasons I can't do this. And there might be folks sitting in your pews that say, I can't believe this would be. And maybe there's some bad reasons for that, right? Some of us, I know I'm greedy. I don't really trust my neighbors. I like my TV. I'd rather not sell it. There's all kinds of maybe more problematic reasons why we might reject the possibility of this kind of community. But I think also there's lots of good reasons why folks like you and me and the people sitting in your pews would say no to this kind of community. How many people in your community and how many of us are caring for children, for older parents, perhaps for disabled folks, that we have obligations to one another? Moreover, how many of us have been scarred and disappointed by the church? How many of us have experienced pastors and leaders who abuse the power that they have? How many of us have been in churches that engender the kind of trust that would say, sell your possessions and we will take care of you? I think people have tried that before and often have been disappointed by communities. So I think this is more complicated than a simple model. I think the way this utopian vision works is, one, drawing us to that deep hope of being of one heart and soul, to examine the reasons why this kind of living together just seems impossible for us, both the reasons that I think I need to weed out of my life, but also the very good reasons why this kind of vision is really difficult for me to imagine. And I think if we preach this text, it's not enough to stop at verse 35. Because right after that, we hear about Levite, who is this incredibly generous person. And then, of course, the beginning of chapter 5, when it starts, but a man named Ananias, and then we hear about Sapphira as well. The chapters and the verse numbers, get added later on. Sometimes they're all the wrong places. And I think this is one example of this. I think we can't read the end of chapter 4 without reading the beginning of chapter 5. Because it seems that part of what Luke wants to narrate here is that as soon as this community starts coming together, as soon as they're of one heart and soul, things also start to fall apart. As soon as people are generous, there are some others who, because of fear, because of greed, because of anxiety, we don't know what the motivations in the Ananias and Sapphira are, but then that community also starts to fall apart. Community, it turns out, is a deeply fragile reality. When we gather together, it's not just a matter of finding some friends or having a social club or finding a place to go, but we hold each other's lives in our hands. And when we hold each other's lives in our hands, there are high stakes involved in the work of community. It's a life and death matter. That how we gather matters deeply to God. But that we still have to negotiate what it means to gather in our own contexts. This isn't just a vision of a utopia we all should emulate, but a place to spark our imaginations, to wonder what would keep us from this kind of community, but also what might it look like in our own context. I'm in this a small group at my church, and we're watching Westerns during Lent. This is the idea of actually a seminary student who's at the church. So yesterday we talked about the movie The Straight Story. Is this a movie anybody? I'd never heard of this movie, never seen it. It's on Disney Plus. It's a movie. It's a David Lynch movie, but it's the most un-David Lynch movie ever. If you've seen some David Lynch stuff, it's about a man, last name is Straight, who takes his John Deere riding lawnmower and takes it at 5 miles an hour, whatever it is, from Iowa to just over the border in Wisconsin. Do you recognize this one? Is this coming back out? So, and how it takes him 6 weeks to make this journey. And it's this really interesting movie about, I think part of it is about the shape of care and how we care for one another. So part of this is he's this very old man, he's got bad hips, and he's driving this very dangerous way, right? On these little narrow roads with trucks going by. And I'm watching this movie and thinking, why did nobody just put him in a car and take him where he needed to go? And part of it has to do, I think, with upper Midwestern sensibilities. You kind of leave people room to do what they're going to do, right? And you don't interfere, right? This is stuff I learned living in Minnesota for 7 years. But I think there's something else too. I think there's also this sense that when it comes to how we care for one another, there's deep agency that communities get to exercise in doing that work. So I wonder if part of what this text might do is help inspire agency about the kind of care we want to practice for one another and not be limited by what we can't imagine doing, but instead freed by all the possibilities of what it might mean for us if we believe, like the apostles did in verse 33, in the power of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. What would it look like if God's grace fell upon us all? What kind of community would we be because we confess God to be a generous God? So that's the second Sunday of Easter, is this utopian story about the believers gathering together. Third Sunday of Easter, we go back in time a little bit, back to Acts chapter 3.
Eric, could
Yes,
I?
yes, please. Yeah, Scott, please.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. I really, starting with verse 33 and reading about what God is up to before you get to the community is just really huge. But I saw something in this text that I haven't seen before. And when it talks about all believers being of one heart and soul or heart and mind, to me, that's warrant for ecclesiastical abuse at times, where you have to believe, or we have to believe, everything the same way, right? So can you say a little bit about that? Maybe how this text might prevent us from doing
Sure.
that?
Yeah, so this will definitely come up. So we'll end with Pentecost, and I have a lot to say about our differences when we come to Pentecost. So if anybody is, some of you all heard me talk before, so you know I always come back to Pentecost. But I think you're right. I think, so how we define that one heart and soul is really important. So is it a bunch of robots who all believe the same thing, who look alike and talk alike and think alike? Or can we imagine that one heart and soul in light of what happens at Pentecost, where everyone hears the gospel preached in their own language? Is there still particularity, right? So we talked earlier about the value and the importance of your own stories and stories of the people gathered in the communities that God has called you to serve. So I think you're right to think like there's a way in which this text can be very easily manipulated to say what unity means is one heart and soul. And what that means is that we all agree on the matters of most importance. And it's not that long a move to say what it means to be of one heart and soul is that you agree with me, the person in charge. I do think that this utopian vision, especially in verse 33, is one reflects God's generosity. But it'd be really easy to misuse this text. It'd be really easy to misuse the beginning of chapter 5 with Ananias and Sapphira. So like, either give your tithes and offerings or God's going to come and like zap you from heaven. That can't be what this text is leading us to proclaim. It can't be. It just doesn't make sense of everything else that we've learned about the character of God that Luke lifts up for us in the gospel in Acts. So you're absolutely right that there's this is text very easily manipulated, and maybe calling attention to that is a really important part of our preaching of that text. It's a great observation, Scott. Anything you would add there? This is great. I love it. Like, right, these texts that we've read a million times and you're like, oh, I've never noticed that before. Anything else you would add, Scott?
I had a good teacher in Rick Carlson at Gettysburg Seminary who walked in one day and said, I've seen something I've never seen before. And that just crashed my world and go, geez, if Rick Carlson can see something that he's never seen before, I guess I can get something there too, right?
Yeah, and that never ends with us, right? I think if, I try to tell my students here, and at Luther too, right, that we train you so well. I think, we teach you Greek, we teach you exegesis, you read a bunch of commentaries, which means you bring a wealth of stuff with you to these communities. And then that's true. What's also true is that there've been people in these communities who've been reading the Bible longer than you've been alive and are able, without the benefit of Greek or any kind of like higher theological education or any formal theological education, I should say, to read circles around you. So both of those things are true, right? We are both deeply invested with all these skills, but we're always going to run into people who see things that we can't see on our own, even with all this training. So very helpful, Scott. Awesome. Anybody else on the end of Acts chapter 4? And definitely feel free to jump in as we go along. All right, third Sunday of Easter, Acts chapter 3, 12 to 19. Would somebody be willing to read that text for us?
when Peter saw it, he addressed the people. You Israelites, why do you wonder at this? Or why do you stare at us? As though by our own power or piety we had made him walk. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of our ancestors has glorified his servant Jesus, whom you handed over and rejected in the presence of Pilate, though he had decided to release him. But you rejected the holy and righteous one and asked to have a murderer given to you. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. And by faith in his name itself has made this man strong, whom you see and know. And the faith that is through Jesus has given him this perfect health in the present. And now, friends, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did also your rulers. In this way, God fulfilled what he had foretold through all the prophets, that his Messiah would suffer. Repent, therefore, and turn to God so that your sins may be wiped out.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. So this is one of those instances where you see the lectionary privileging the speech. So not the narration that begins at the beginning of chapter 3 of the disabled man who's at the beautiful gate, but the response afterwards. So even the first text, when Peter saw it, will leave people wondering, well, what was it? What was it that Peter saw? What is it that happened that precipitated this event? So if we're going to preach this text, I think giving more attention to the narrative than the lectionary does will be really important in framing this work. So we have this instance that echoes in a lot of ways a lot of the healing stories that Jesus is engaged in the Gospel of Luke. Peter and John are going up to the temple. This is verse 1 in chapter 3. We'll notice in the beginning of Acts how often people keep coming back to the temple. And indeed, Paul's missionary journeys are not like linear going out further and further, but there are these loops that keep coming back over and over to the temple. The temple remains the heartbeat of this narrative story and the place where the apostles are gathered most. So they're going to prayer. We find out a man, and the NRSV has here lame from birth. And so the NRSV is going through some minor revisions right now. And I did some work looking at the text of Acts. And one of the places that I hope desperately that the NRSV changes is not using words like lame and crippled, which are terms that we've turned away from, I think, often. I can't imagine a context where I would call somebody who is in front of me lame or crippled, right? So here I've been using the word of disability a lot more. So this is an opportunity here. I think I want to give you permission to not say the word lame here and to use a different kind of term. So here, a disabled man, somebody who was disabled from birth, was being carried in. So a very typical healing narrative, right? Peter and John come in, they see him. The disabled man assumes that he's going to receive some alms as he does every day. But instead, Peter heals him and makes his feet and ankles strong, as it says in verse 7. And the man jumps up, begins to walk. He entered the temple with them, walking and leaping and praising God. And people recognize who this is. So it's this. I think often what happens in the Gospel of Luke and that we miss is that when Jesus heals people, he isn't just healing individuals. He's healing whole communities around them. In the way that when these healed people walk about in the world, they are these embodiments of the good news of Jesus. They're not simple. They're not like, I think sometimes when I think about the mission trips I took in church growing up, so we'd go somewhere and you'd go like dig a well or like paint a building. You'd do something during the day, and then you would invite people to come to the service at night so they could hear the gospel, as if they weren't hearing the gospel all day in the contributions we were making to that community. I think sometimes we treat the healing narratives similarly, that they're kind of like these fireworks meant to draw a crowd so that Jesus could tell them what was really happening. Or in this case, everybody looks at the formerly disabled man who's now healed, And Peter gets to tell them the good news of Jesus. But I think it's better to think about the ways that these people who are transformed are walking embodiments of the good news of Jesus. And second, then, that it's not just they who are transformed, but the whole community around them who see this person differently than they have before. The other little detail, which is one of those things I hadn't noticed before, was a little detail in the second part of verse 2. Luke writes that people would lay him daily at the gate of the temple so that he could ask for alms. I think sometimes my picture of this man was that he was just kind of off by himself without other support. But I think here we see an instance of a community coming around him, trying their best to help him. And the best that they can do is to put him at this gate in this prominent place to get the support and help that he needed. This reminds me of the story of the widow of Nain. So you remember the story, right? That she has lost a son and he's sitting on the bier and they're bringing him out and Jesus stops. And I think often we preachers and scholars will tend to stress the vulnerability of widows in antiquity. But in doing that, we miss the fact that the whole community, it says, Luke says, had come out with the widow, mourning with her, wondering what it might look like for them to be a support of her. So here to think about this disabled person who's made well, not just as an individual, but as someone part of a larger community who's rallied around him, who's tried to help him as best they can. And that Jesus here transforms everyone's relationality. The other thing I'll say about these texts, and here disability scholarship has been really influential for me and really helpful. There's a 1-volume commentary called Disability in the Bible that Baylor University Press has produced. It's expensive. It's like $50. It's the only downside to this. It's pricier than I would like it to be. But it's disability perspectives from the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament that I've found super helpful. One thing here, I think it's important in our preaching when we preach these healing texts, is that we remind ourselves and we remind our communities that we do not get to name other people's wholeness. Jesus can do that. So even with the widow of Nain never asks for help. She doesn't go to Jesus and say, can you bring my son back? Perhaps because she is so deep in grief that she's kind of in a place of hoping against hope, right? That naming what you might need in that moment, it just seems too unbelievable. Jesus can see our deepest needs, can see the shape of what our wholeness might be. We are really bad at that. In fact, we fail at it constantly. When I was in seminary, I did some, it wasn't CPE, but it was basically CPE with a supervisor who had cerebral palsy. So he would sometimes be in a wheelchair, sometimes he would not be. But he told me that people would, like strangers, would come up to him at the grocery store, at the post office, and tap him on the shoulder and say, you know, if you prayed hard enough, God would let you walk out of that wheelchair. And I think our preaching isn't that baldly terrible at people, but I think sometimes in putting up these healing stories, it might precipitate in folks in our congregations wondering, well, I've been praying for a healing and it's never happened to me. Is it because I'm not faithful, because God doesn't love me? Or there are folks in our communities that we might think, other people might think need some healing, need to be made whole, when they're actually right where God and where they want to be. We don't get to name other people's wholeness. There's all these great YouTube videos of children when they receive a cochlear ear implant. I don't know if you've seen these, right? Where they hear their mother's voice for the first time. It's beautiful. Like it's just like this gorgeous moment of connection. There are folks in the deaf community who don't like those videos because they don't see this physical condition as something that needs to be remediated, right? They can speak, they can communicate. The problem isn't that they can't hear, it's that we do not know how to speak. So I think here we have to think carefully about how we imagine how this healing is a picture, this embodiment of salvation in a way that is broad and helpful to all kinds of folks. So all that is what precipitates Peter's proclamation here. So Peter starts in verse 12, you Israelites, Why do you wonder at this? Or why do you stare at us as though by our own power or piety we made him walk? Notice the first move that Peter makes is to point to the God who made this disabled man well, who saw this man's deepest needs, but also what this community might be when he was made well. I'll say one more thing about disability here. I think if we think about these healings as individual realities, then we just see the problem, folks, that need to be made well, and then we'll all be okay, instead of seeing the ways that our community might be so bent out of shape that we're not creating space for people with all kinds of different experiences in their lives. That maybe it's the community that needs to change more than the individual. So here, Peter pointing to the power of God who has made this person well. And then it gets striking. So this happens in chapter 2 as well, in the aftermath of Pentecost. But look at verse 14. But you rejected the holy and righteous one and asked to have a murderer given to you. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. Very easy to imagine how this text might be used to place blame on those first century Jews and now their descendants today, to blame them for the death of Jesus. But if we think back to how Luke narrates the cross, I think we might think differently about what's happening here. So remember, in Luke's account, the people come out to see a spectacle. They come out to see a show, and when they see the way that Jesus dies, they go away beating their breast in grief over what they've seen. And I think in some ways, as we're following Luke's narrative, we're kind of coming out to the cross to see a show too. Some of us back in the 2000s came out to see precisely such a show with Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, right? It was a spectacle. It was a show. And I think too many Christians went away from that experience grateful for what God had done for them, which is true, but maybe missing how ashamed we should have been of seeing something we shouldn't have seen. In that way, the you here isn't just the folks gathered in that place, but any one of us who would go out to see a spectacle, to see a show, to see empire flex its muscles, to those of us who see in empire's violence a sense of protection for ourselves, that if we execute that one guy over there, then the rest of us will be okay. And in that way, we participate in the death of Jesus. We participate in the killing of the author of life. To this, we are witnesses. This reference here to this, we are witnesses, goes back to Acts chapter 1, when Jesus calls the disciples, so 1:8, when Jesus calls the disciples to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And I grew up in the church where we loved that text. And what it meant is that we had to go to other places and tell people about Jesus. That's what it meant to be a witness. But I think that gets it half right and half wrong. Because part of being a witness, I think, in the book of Acts is going to spaces and talking about what Jesus has done in our lives. But the other half of witness is pointing to those moments of resurrection in these communities, moments where God has already acted before us, and naming them or helping a community notice those places where God has already been living and active, already making the resurrection difference in those midst. It's not just about telling the stuff I know about Jesus, but naming the ways that Jesus is present and helping a community names the way that Jesus has already been present among them. Verse 16, and by faith in his name itself has made this man strong. We'll see this appeal to Jesus' name throughout the Acts of the Apostles, but it's another reminder that even when it's Peter laying hands on somebody, it's not Peter's hands who's making somebody well. It's the name of Jesus. And although Jesus has been ascended at the beginning of in chapter 1, Jesus' presence is still with them because Jesus' name is still with them. So I think part of what this text is doing for us, maybe one place we might go with our preaching, is having us wonder about power. The power to make whole, the power to bring life, power to draw communities together. Where does that power come from? And to what end is God exercising that power? That power comes from God, but why? What is God trying to do in drawing us together in this way? And part of it, I think, is to experience the freedom, the liberation of the resurrection life. Again, like I started earlier, we know what death looks like, feels like. We need a lot more help thinking about what resurrection might look like. And presumably, there won't be some disabled person who will all of a sudden be able to walk in your community on Sunday when you're preaching that text. But can you help folks look at less extraordinary moments of healing, but equally transformative moments when the resurrection power of Jesus has predominated and when that power has made all the difference? So again, one of those places where the lectionary wants to take us to the sermon, but if we're going to go to the sermon, let's go through it by looking at the narrative first, and the way the narrative gives us a picture of God's character and thus the character of our communities. All right, we made some progress. Got a few more texts to go. So we'll make it all the way to Pentecost between tomorrow and Wednesday. Any last minute thoughts, questions, anything before we close our time together? I'm gonna try to be as on the dot as possible because I know your lives are full. And if there are other questions, like pile them up. We'll have a bunch of time on Wednesday. So make sure not just your questions, but anything that you notice in these texts as you're thinking about them during this week. Teach me some stuff that I wouldn't otherwise know. Oh, I forgot. I was going to give you an assignment. Okay. So if you were to preach these Acts texts in the season after Easter, like let's suppose you're going to do a whole series. We're just going to do the Acts texts from Easter to Pentecost. Acts text from Easter to Pentecost. What would you call that sermon series? So that's your assignment for the week. As you're looking at these texts and reading them, if you're going to do that whole series, what would you call that series overall? So think about that. And I would love to hear some of those titles on Wednesday when we wrap up looking at these texts. I won't grade you though. So go nuts, have fun. I'm giving some of you grades, but that time was long ago.
We already got the P for pastor.
P for pastor. I loved it. I missed that pass was pass marginal fail at Luther, right?
I think so, yeah.
And here is pass D fail. I don't know what the D stands for, but
I have a question real quick. I pulled over so I could turn my video on and let you know that, yes, I have been listening the whole time. Thank you so much. I was curious, that healing story that precedes the sermon that we just heard. I can't remember where I heard this, so this is one of those great things where I'm like, okay, I don't have a source for this, but that there was the possibility that the people who were bringing the disabled man to collect alms were taking advantage of him. That it wasn't actually collecting alms for him, but for their sake. Is that just reading something into the text that's probably not there?
Like they were getting a kickback, right? So like,
yeah.
So it's not clear, right? It doesn't tell us why they did it. So I think here there's some room for us to have some homiletical imagination about this. We won't know for certain, right, why they did this. But for me, with that pattern with the widow of Nain, the community coming out with them, and right, this is something that Luke does, like these stories in Acts echo the stories in Luke, that I think there's enough connection there for me to think that there may be something deeply generous of what people are doing there. It doesn't tell us that they're trying to take advantage of him. He is in a vulnerable spot. And part of me wants to think, why didn't they do more? But also a lot of these folks were living kind of on the edge of existence in the ancient world, right? So you had like this tiny, tiny elite that had a lot of power and wealth. You did have a sliver of people who were artisans and merchants who weren't living at subsistence level, but they weren't exactly middle class either. But the vast majority of people are poor and or enslaved. And in this case, we see a picture of that. So this is a community. I like to imagine this is a community trying to care for him. And part of what that might do is in our preaching is to remind people that these, even before Jesus shows up in these communities, God's already present and active and living in them. It's not as if these are like desolate, terrible places until Jesus shows up. There's a life of God already there. And part of what it means to be a witness then is to notice the ways that God has proceeded as that God has already been there. So I think homiletically, to me, that's an advantage in preaching the story and helping nurture a community that expects when you go to nowhere, we'll talk about that idea somewhere, right? That we expect God to have already been there. And God's grace is already present there. And it's not that we're bringing God's grace in my suitcase. And here's God's grace, this thing that you didn't know you needed. And now you have because I brought it to you. No, God has already brought it to that place. So that's what I see there. But I think either way, right? I think you could go either way. The text doesn't resolve that for us. Like in the same way that it doesn't tell us why Ananias and Sapphira did this. The motivations aren't entirely clear there. It's a great question, Brian.
Maybe this was the guy's job. I mean, that's all he could do was sit and beg. And so those people brought him to his daily job.
Yep. And then like the community in this way to like provided for him, right? Right. The people would walk by and give alms. They were doing and it wasn't like not just their neighborly obligation, but their religious obligation as Jews. Like this is what you're supposed to do. This is what God has called us to be for one another. So I like to imagine that this is a story of people being faithful, and then the way that Jesus' emergence like allows for this other way of imagining resurrection to occur as well. Awesome. All right, it's 2:02, y'all. This is fun. Hopefully see you tomorrow. We'll probably plow through 4 weeks of text so that what we can do on Wednesday is focus on the Pentecost speech and then some time for conversation for us to have together. So what I imagine Wednesday is less today, and tomorrow is just me jabbering a lot. I'll jabber a little bit on Wednesday, and then I'd love to hear from you all and see how you might think about these texts in a preaching series. So awesome.
Okay. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, friends.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
then.